Ms. Gray, I'll have a series of questions for you right now. I finished up my last line of questioning, speaking about how location data could establish somebody as being HIV positive or having mental illness or the military personnel, et cetera. I understand the organization with which you work considers kind of location data to be personal information that should be regulated. Can you kind of comment upon that, please?
Certainly. Commercial location data of the nature of the data that's frequently bought and sold in the data broker industry is often tied to not necessarily name and contact information, but device identifiers, such as a device ID related to a mobile phone. That has led many in the industry to claim at times that the data is not personally identifiable, that it's been anonymized or pseudonymized or de-identified to a certain extent. And while the risk may have been lessened, the fact remains that persistent, precise location information over time is very straightforward to relate back to an individual person because our behaviors and our movements are unique over time. And so that's one of the unique challenges specific to the location commercial data industry.
I'm sorry, I had to stop my video. My phone was, my computer is about to die. So y'all are getting a tour of my kitchen. I apologize for that. Secondly, related to that, what is the difference between suppressing data? I call my data broker. I contact them. I say, I don't want my data to be marketed, et cetera. How do I ask them to get rid of it? And I'm told that oftentimes they don't get rid of it, they suppress, but suppression is different than deletion. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, Senator. Suppression is an industry term that is frequently used for the purpose of describing when a company maintains a list of individual consumers or individuals or devices for the purpose of excluding those individuals or devices from their products and services, but not necessarily deleting the underlying data. And there can be a range of reasons to do that. One of them, for example, is to comply in an ongoing manner with deletion or opt-out requests that are required by some of the emerging privacy laws. For example, data brokers that automatically collect large amounts of information from public records may receive a request to delete data from an individual, delete that data, but be unable to continue to delete data on that individual in the future unless they retain a limited suppression list.
In that case, you suggest that that's actually a positive thing in which they would be using the suppression to mark this. So is it a positive or a negative that data is merely suppressed as opposed to eliminated?
I would say, Senator, that it depends on the use case. There are other higher risk marketing and advertising use cases related to suppression lists. As we've heard, for example, some marketers and advertisers wish to exclude certain segments of the population from receiving advertisements that may be deemed offensive. For example, a list of households associated with the loss of a child or the loss of a pregnancy may be a list that a marketer uses to exclude those households from receiving marketing and advertising related to baby products, right? That's an example. And so it depends on the use, and there's some risk associated, particularly with those more sensitive categories of information just by the maintenance of a suppression list.
So there's clearly a nuance here. And frankly, if we're going to attempt to address that in legislation, we would need someone such as you and your organization to help elaborate on that nuance. Because it actually sounds like it could be a positive thing, although you suggest that there is a potential negative as well. So that said, let me ask you about the next thing, because I think this is another nuance. In your written testimony, I believe it was you who spoke of the fact that this big data can be very helpful. You wish to look at, just give an example, I'm not sure it ever came to full fruition, but it has in other countries, using location data to establish who may have been at a conference in which in which COVID is known to have affected people, and so therefore you can do that. I know there's after Mardi Gras in March of 2020, people used location data to figure out where everybody went back to from New Orleans after Mardi Gras and where people had come from, and they were able to establish that COVID came to New Orleans from both the Northwest and the Northeast. So clearly, people are using data in another sense. So what is the nuance between using the data appropriately for public health purposes, as an example, as opposed to, or maybe to let me know how congested the highway is, and should I take this route or should I take another, as opposed to be using it somewhat nefariously, if you will?
You're right, Senator, to point out that there are essentially good uses and bad uses of this data. For example, in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were large commercial data sets held by both first parties, including Google, and members of the commercial location data broker industry that provided aggregate analysis of how people were moving around to help assist public health efforts. So there are both good and bad use cases. One of the nuances here is that when we talk about fair information practices and privacy and having a realm of private life, there are increasing concerns around the fact that data is collected in the first place, even when it might be later used for good or beneficial purposes. There is nonetheless a zone of private life that I think most agree should not be intruded upon. In other cases, most consumers are aware that they're sharing location data, for example, for a particular service, and not aware that it may be reused for a secondary or incompatible purpose. And things like commercial research and public health purposes are technically incompatible purposes because that's not the reason that the data was necessarily provided. And so crafting nuanced exemptions here related to sources of data, sensitivity of data, risk related to harms to individuals and groups and society are all part of crafting effective regulation here.
And since I'll finish with this and turn it back to you, Madam Chair, but since I sincerely think, in fact, observationally, it can't be disputed, that we come up with better legislation when a hearing such as this takes information from those who are stakeholders and academics and others who analyze and try and get those nuances down. Again, I ask you to contact my staff afterwards with some idea of those nuances, and that's an open invitation to everybody on the panel. Madam Chair, I turn back to you.